Welcome, everybody. Thank you for dialing in to the Chevy Chase Speaker Series. Welcome to a new year of presenting very interesting topics that hopefully we'll find beneficial. This has been an in-person series for the last few years, and due to the pandemic, we're trying to do a pivot to a Zoom presentation, and one of my colleagues on the committee, Meet, is a member of Leadership Now, and Leadership Now is an advocacy for strengthening democracy in the country, and I thought that'd be a very appropriate time to bring them in to address the topic of repairing democracy currently. So I'm going to hand it over to Amit, who's going to introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Lance. Good afternoon to the Chevy Chase community. We're really pleased to have you join today. For those that have joined in person, it's nice and really grateful to Lance for this opportunity to try this out in virtual format. This is quite an eventful week for democracy here in the United States, and we thought what better way to kick off the series in 2021 than to have two well-regarded and well-known individuals in democracy advocacy. I'd like to first introduce Daniella. Daniella is CEO of the Leadership Now project. She was previously a partner and director for the Americas at Dahlberg. She joined Dahlberg in 2004 to help grow it from really a startup to now one of the leading global groups for social impact businesses with 25 offices throughout the world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, and of course, Europe and the US. She returned to Dahlberg after serving for 5 years as the senior advisor for development to the Secretary of State, serving under Secretaries Clinton and Kerry. And she started her career at Bain & Company, where she and I originally met 20 plus years ago. What were we, Daniella, like 5 when we were working at Bain?
Exactly,
then,
toddlers.
Right? That's right, we were toddlers back then. And she's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and on World Economic Forum Young Global Leaders as well, where she serves on the advisory council. She holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and an MPA from the Harvard Kennedy School and a bachelor's in operations from Cornell. So welcome, Daniella. We've also got Grant on. Grant Tudor is a policy advocate at Protect Democracy. Grant was most recently a senior manager of political reform at Harvard's Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness. Before that, he was a founding partner at Nucleus Impact, a behavioral research and design group. He's been a visiting fellow at UNRWA, a UN refugee agency, and with the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, a group that mediates armed conflict. Grant received his MBA from Harvard Business School and his MPP from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. I'm seeing a theme here, Daniella and Grant, on your MBA, MPP, and he was also a fellow at the Center for Public Leadership. So really want to say thank you to both of you, and I'll turn it over to you, Daniella.
Thanks so much, Meet. Nice to see some familiar faces and new ones in Chevy Chase. And the more I've become involved in American democracy protection and renewal, the more important kind of local leadership and engagement in politics is clearly needed. And today is interesting as the DC statehood bill was entered. So we were certainly kind of in the midst of a lot of political energy here in DC, you know, in addition to the inauguration and everything else. So I know everyone's kind of exhausted about politics, even DC people. So I appreciate all of you being here today to just dive in a bit more in terms of what is the state of our democracy and where do we go from here. So a quick context on the Leadership Now project. We're a membership organization founded in 2017 of business and thought leaders across the country working to protect and renew American democracy. As Amit had mentioned, a lot of my career was in foreign policy and on the international development side. And, you know, I'd seen both in other countries and when, you know, looking historically, how much business and civil society were important in preventing slides towards autocracy. And when you didn't have business engaged or on the kind of wrong side of that equation, countries were really at risk. So part of the rationale of starting this group in 2017 with a group of at the time, fellow business school alumni, was to really build a group of business executives and entrepreneurs across the country who were engaged in our democracy, who were paying attention, and were ready to really put their minds and resources towards protecting it. So I'll share, a little bit, a couple of things just to note. One, what I'm going to share is this analysis. When we started in 2017, we really were asking, I think, all of the questions that many of us were asking then, which was, how do we get here? And what were the drivers of a weak system, and that had allowed Trump to arise and such extreme polarization to arise. And we wanted to go beyond just a basic partisan explanation. So we continue to, and we worked in 2017 and 2018 in an in-depth way with academics and doing data analysis to really get a landscape of the state of American democracy. What were the drivers? What did the data tell us about where we were and where we were going, and what we might be able to do to fix it? So the presentation I'm about to share is a few years old. A lot has happened between now and then, needless to say, but I think still, and we're updating some of the data to reflect this election, but it still, I think, speaks to some of the fundamental challenges that we face, and I'll end that with some of what's happened just around the election and the type of mobilization that I think we've all seen. It bodes well for more engagement in our democracy, but is also, I think President Biden yesterday spoke a fair bit about democracy and said that, this was a win, this election, in this election, democracy prevailed. And I think that was right. But I think we have a lot of work to do to keep, to keep that democracy vibrant, and also to really modernize it in some quite significant ways as we go forward. So let me put up this presentation. Just a moment. Great, here we go. Great. So as I mentioned, when the organization started, we really sought to understand the state of the system. And we, as you'll see here, we sought to do it in a way that was quite quantitative. So we called it a market map because we wanted to look at the flows of dollars and influences in the system and how they were affecting each other. So I'll just start with just this quick snapshot of Leadership Now. Who we are, our goals. We've focused on having 4 principles to guide our engagement in the system and really work with our members to be able to kind of fulfill their obligation to be part of fixing the system. And we do that by working with academics, providing analysis and recommendations of how members can both put their time and financial resources in support of democracy, and kind of building a dynamic community around that in the cities where we have particular membership, which is 6 cities, and then we have members in 25 states now across the country. So, this question of how did we get here, I know this is a pretty expert audience. So a lot of this won't necessarily look new, but I think there's still some striking data in here that is just a reminder of where we are. And I think this first piece of trust in government at historic lows is really concerning. And then when you combine that with what the data says around low trust amongst every sector of society, amongst government, business, that is even faith leaders, that's a really worrying dynamic that we face. Interestingly, last week, the Edelman Trust Barometer came out and showing that business was the most trusted segment of society right now. Now, that was a low bar because no one's trusted, but I think that's an interesting reflection of all of the dynamics we're facing right now. So we have the state of extremely low trust. And I think the other data point here that's really telling is the correlation. What this looks at is the correlation between citizen preferences and probability that legislation is ultimately passed. And, the short story on the left-hand side, right, is that there is zero correlation between citizen preferences and whether a legislation is adopted. And this is from 2014, right? So for quite some time, it's not surprising that Americans don't feel trust or that the system is serving them. Obviously, the other chart looks at what is quite a high correlation between what the authors consider economic elite preferences and adoption of legislation.
And Daniella, does that mean, for example, that like say gun control, which is something that has wide preference, but the legislation can't get passed? That's an example of the yellow that they have.
Yeah, and I think what it also says, for sure, I mean, there's multiple infrastructure, gun control, healthcare legislation, even though there's high support from the public, it doesn't pass. It also says that the things that do pass are ones, if something the public wants does pass, it's not really because of them. It's because there's been enough kind of elite preference or special interest preference that's supported it.
Gotcha.
And so what we've looked at in particular as kind of underlying drivers of the system over the last several years is around voting access, electoral systems, and how to make them more fair, for instance, through objective redistricting and ranked choice voting, addressing money in politics, and then strengthening talent pipelines, right? So all kind of like the infrastructure of democracy. And to understand how to target those efforts, we dug into actually where the resources were flowing and what they were impacting. So this is what we call kind of to understand what we call the democracy market, kind of who are the players, where are they putting resources, especially because since Citizens United a decade ago, there's a lot more money flowing into politics, a lot of new entities and actors that are participating. So we looked at the flows from a whole set of sources of dollars to various types of organizations. So not just political campaigns, but also 501c3 organizations, C4s, unions, trade associations, et cetera, and how they were influencing the system. I'm not going to share all of that analysis here, but I'll share a couple of things that came out of that. So one was just looking at scale of resources. So when we look this kind of expansive view of resources in the system beyond just campaigns and committees, we came to about 56 billion of political spend. This is going to go up with this cycle because that was around 7-8 billion in campaign spend at that time. This presidential election alone, we've had 14 billion. So we'll see these numbers go into the 60 plus billion in total spend, if not 70. And the other thing we did then was really understand how some of the segments of the market are working, where there's particularly new political dollars that are influencing the system. So for instance, 501c4s, which are where some dark money is channeled. You can see that there's a whole set of issue groups on the left and on the right who are influencing, needless to say, targeting different issues. One thing I will note is that as we were doing this new analysis for 2020, the left-hand side, so the liberal-leaning groups, is a larger number than right-leaning. So we have seen a shift in political dollars that Democrats are now outraising Republicans. We can decide how we feel. If that, we're worried about the ultimately you have the political dollars arms race that may be never ending. But I think the short takeaway is that dollars are no longer the differentiator between the parties, and they're at par, if not Democrats are higher. And the final area we looked at was lobbying spend, influence, corporate influence, et cetera. And, I think what you see overall is that lobbying is dominated on private industry organizations like the Chamber, Business Roundtable, whereas you see a lot less from unions and other entities. So that all kind of gives you this full picture, 58 billion in political spend that influences a $4 trillion federal budget. And it is also, we compared that to philanthropic spend, which is about 450 billion. a year. Substantial, obviously. So even though the 58 billion is big, it's much smaller than what's spent in philanthropy in this country. And needless to say, what's happening on the left-hand side of the chart is having a significant influence on what many in philanthropy hope to achieve, right? So if you're a nonprofit that aims to work on inequality or climate change or otherwise, the fact that the left-hand side and the federal part are legislation and over the last 4 years has not been supportive, obviously is having a big impact on the impact of overall organizations. And what I'll finally say about this kind of market analysis, so to speak, is when you look at that political spend, almost all of it is being spent on campaigns, either political campaigns, issues, or to advance a particular interest group agenda. There's very little that's being spent to actually kind of reform and strengthen the system. This number's gone up a bit in the last couple of years, so maybe we'll reach 1% of political spend that's working on, strengthening things like voting rights, addressing gerrymandering, building new talent pipelines, et cetera. But it's still a very small piece. The majority of dollars essentially go to not just issues and campaigns, but ultimately end up as media spend. So as television ads, as digital ads, et cetera. That's the bulk of the dollars, which from our perspective has questionable value for democracy when it's such large share of the dollars are just trying to convince the next voter for the next campaign. And so I'll finish up with what we've seen about the role of business in this system and what expectations are. I'll start with a poll that was done in October 2020 by Just Capital, an organization we work with, that was asking what Americans were expecting of companies in democracy. And it looked at both positive things that companies could do as well as kind of reducing negative actions. So for instance, the majority of respondents thought companies should play their role to make voting easier. They also thought that companies should limit their lobbying and political spend where it was not advancing the interests of a broader American public, to work on disinformation, safeguarding elections. Interestingly, this poll was actually before a fair number of companies actually took those actions. But we actually saw in the months that followed this poll that companies were called to take a stand on many of these issues, and ultimately a fair number have. I'll share a little bit about what we're involved in and what we saw. So one, we saw that in the kind of 6 months before election, a pretty significant groundswell of companies got involved in supporting voter participation, both in terms of their own companies, their own employees, and their customers. But something that was really interesting that I think has evolved in the last few months is that we joined with our members and executives like Reid Hoffman and others to put out a statement in early October calling for all votes to be counted and creating kind of a business position on that. Ultimately, that was echoed by the Chamber of Commerce and Business Roundtable and others. But it was really in the last few weeks that we saw companies then translate with the insurrection, translate those commitments into starting to quite a few companies pulling back from PAC spending on candidates who supported the insurrection, which is something that has been discussed for some time about shifting corporate spending, but this has been a kind of a dramatic shift in a short time period. And we put out a guide around things that companies could do, both in terms of pulling back spending, corporate PAC spending from those candidates who don't support democracy, as well as pulling advertising from vehicles, from media channels that are undermining the system, et cetera. So we've seen a lot of movement on those actions in the last few weeks. And I think that is where I end. So, obviously this is all moving all moving much quicker in some ways than I think many of us expected who'd been working for some time. I mean, we've been working on several years on these issues. There are organizations that have worked for a decade or more around, getting stronger both legislation and culture around democracy. And I think, we are at a genuine inflection point where we could see action both by individuals, by companies, and by advocates to drive action, legislation, et cetera. So I've given a few examples, what we've seen on the corporate side. Grant Tudor, who was introduced by Amit and is a member and partner in all of this, is right in the middle of what the legislative agenda looks like right now for protecting democracy going forward. So I'll hand it over to you, Grant, to share some reflections.
Great, thanks, Daniella. So for those who aren't familiar, Protect Democracy is a nonpartisan nonprofit that got its start shortly after the 2016 election. It was started by some former White House counsel and senior Department of Justice attorneys, and was mostly formed to litigate against the Trump administration's kind of most egregious abuses of power. But over time, we kind of developed a more integrated advocacy approach. So we brought on policy folks like myself and media folks to kind of partner with our council on various efforts to kind of combat the rise of authoritarianism, not just embodied by the president, but in ways that were really prevalent at the state level as well. So we spent kind of a lot of the last few years engaging in litigation against both the federal government, especially when there seemed to be kind of significant breakdowns in checks and balances, and at the state level, especially with efforts to, for example, illegally take voters off the rolls, disenfranchise large swaths of populations in swing states, things like that. But then, and I'm sharing this because I, will connect it a little bit to kind of what I think like the next few years will look like for us at least, and what I think some of the priorities ought to be going forward. But we also kind of spent the past couple of years standing up big, broad national coalitions, including with business, to kind of proactively protect the integrity of the 2020 election, models that I think can be used again for the next election, mobilize civil servants to protect institutions that were very much under assault over the past 4 years. So for example, we organized over 2,000 Justice Department former prosecutors who would occasionally speak out when the department was under its most political pressure to do blatantly unconstitutional things. And to reference what Daniella was suggesting, started working really aggressively with partners on the Hill to kind of lay the groundwork for reforms that we knew there would be a window of opportunity either right after this election, and that's the case, thankfully, or possibly in 4 years down the road. So I think, we see kind of like three major categories of work to shore up democracy, which is just saying that is such like an abstract, it's so abstract, but I think these kind of three categories, at least for us, help to frame kind of what the agenda should look like going forward. Number one is what we call rear guard action. So I think one of the things we're most nervous about is this idea that because Trump lost the election, like now, like we're good, like, right, the threat has abated, when in fact, the threat of authoritarianism and the weakening of democracy in the US, as Daniella was suggesting, predated this administration, right? Like if you look at independent scores like VDEM of the strength of America's democratic institutions, I mean, it's been on the decline for well over the past decade, if not more. And so, so kind of thinking about ways to kind of address authoritarian impulses in the US is kind of step number one, given that those impulses are not going away. I think for us, that immediately looks like accountability measures, the US taking a more aggressive approach to truth-telling and enforcing consequences for blatantly undemocratic behavior. So, in practice for us, that looks like pushing the Justice Department to take a really impartial approach to investigations and prosecutions, working with members of Congress to stand up committees that can do things like investigate the events of January 6th and everything that led up to it. And then I think importantly, beyond some of like the formal mechanisms within government, working with partners in business to effectuate change in a way that helps to both stand up guardrails, but also to enforce accountability in kind of more informal ways. So for example, there's a lot of folks that are going to be leaving the Trump administration who engaged in really serious wrongdoing across government. And those folks are going to apply for jobs. You know, after Watergate as one particular model, there was a lot of efforts by associations like the American Bar Association, certain business associations, to start creating really transparent criteria for like what hiring former officials should look like, given that one of the major risks, as we see it, is former officials reputationally rehabilitating themselves, re-entering government and recommitting some of those same abuses. Or, as Daniella mentioned, corporations taking a much finer look at the ways in which their money moves through the system. I mean, we're only now learning, and I think it's probably the tip of the iceberg, the way that dark money, initially coming from general treasuries among public companies, the way that that money moved through dark nonprofits and financed the events of January 6th. So I think for us, one of the really interesting opportunities is engaging the business community to take a really proactive approach in both analyzing what went wrong over the past 4 years and how they can be a part of the solution going forward. And then I think, you know, the second big category of work is the windows of opportunity now, which are non-trivial. You know, we've been laying the groundwork for some time legislatively on a variety of bills, largely modeled after the post-Watergate moment. And for those who are unfamiliar, a couple Congresses after Watergate were some of the most productive in American history, not just in terms of the volume of legislation, but the specific focus on rebalancing the branches, reining in executive power, improving the integrity of national elections. So we've done years now of work looking at some of those bills, both as models of inspiration and also where they really fell short, and have tried to take those learnings into legislation that we've been proactively pushing through Committee on the Hill for the past few years. Just as an example, kind of in addition to some of the ones that are more familiar, like HR 1 and HR 4, the kind of the Renewed Voting Rights Act, we've kind of helped to put together the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which is specifically focused on reining in executive power and re-empowering Congress. And then I think lastly, and this is obviously the part that is much less explored given the urgency of issues over the past few years, but I think like there's some renewed mental space to think about what we call like big long-term bets. You know, some of the structural features in American democracy that make it really vulnerable are going to be like the toughest to change, but need really big thinking. So everything from obviously familiar things like the Electoral College to less sometimes familiar things like single member districts that just fundamentally skew representation in the US and leave a lot of people disillusioned with the system. And so we're investing some significant energy in imagining what some of those solutions might look like. And again, I think one of the really interesting things for us is, especially with our collaborations with Leadership Now, is where business can be a source of support. I mean, it turns out business is a really important fulcrum, including on the Hill. and when they speak up in support of certain reforms, things that were previously not politically viable suddenly become something to put on the table.
Oh, thank you very much for that, Grant and Daniella. That was great. This is a meet again. I just wanted to open it up for questions, but I'll just make a quick comment that I think what we're seeing at this moment in the country is a real awakening. You know, as Daniella said earlier, democracy is trending, and this is a moment where we're excited to have this opportunity to have a discussion here locally with the Chevy Chase community, here in the DC broader community, because there is an opportunity for all of us to be engaged in some way. You know, I was the business guy, kind of doing my own thing, and you know, when everything started falling apart, or at least becoming more visible, not just at the national level, but at the state level, I became more aware. And that's when reconnecting with Daniella really got us much more aware. We are, between my wife, Luce, who's on, and myself, we're on a call, if not 2 calls a week, that either organizations like Daniella or Grant or others are organizing, becoming more aware of advocacy groups and ways to fund and support, and just becoming more engaged as citizens, because citizenry goes beyond voting. And I think that's become something I've become more aware of. So just to follow up on Grant's point, that it wasn't necessarily a moment or an administration, it's been more of kind of an awakening, I think, at a broader level that we're having. So let me open it up for questions, comments, thoughts for Daniella and Grant as we celebrate engagement on this Zoom chat.
I see there was a question already about Citizens United.
Oh, here it is. Yep, good.
And Grant, you should feel free to add to this. I certainly think that there's an effort, there's an organization that we collaborate with that's focused on America's Promise, that is focused on getting an amendment to the Constitution to reverse Citizens United. There are, within bills, upcoming bills like HR 1, which is the For the People Act that was just introduced in the House and the Senate. They include things like public financing, transparency requirements on campaign finance to reduce dark money. There are also efforts that we're involved in to just create as much transparency around the existing dollars. So I think shooting for a constitutional amendment is worthwhile, but I also think that we should be working. There's a set of both legislative and voluntary actions that can be taken in the immediate term that can really still have an impact. And I think, the example of pulling, companies pulling funding from candidates that supported the insurrection, transparency efforts. There's now an independent rating of corporate transparency, for instance, but, also kind of individuals, the transparency around individuals and reporting in the press, et cetera. So I just, I think it shouldn't be binary, I guess, is my overall point, that it's just like either we kind of turn back Citizens United or nothing. We should be working on all of the pieces that improve that system while also trying to reverse it.
Yeah, I would add, and I think this is largely what Daniella's, I think this is what you're saying, but I would just like put an exclamation point on the fact that there's like a lot of low hanging fruit in like the campaign finance space. And unfortunately, I think absent a constitutional amendment, Citizens United, and frankly, the 5 decades of rulings that led up to it, like Buckley v. Vallejo, which gutted the campaign finance bills that came out of the Watergate era, none of that's going away anytime soon, absent really big change like that. At the same time, like the space for bills around transparency, rulemaking around transparency, even outside the legislative process, are significant, and they're also bipartisan. Like, not totally, but past bills have garnered significant support across the aisle, and so a lot of these things I think are actually well within reach if there's enough push from the outside to make it happen.
Agreed. And what's interesting is now that the money's equal on both sides, your potential to get both sides to come to the table starts going up because no one has a big advantage. And I also, the one other thing I would say is that, ultimately legislation always has an element, and even Supreme Court decisions have like some element of reflecting kind of where society is at, not perfectly, but, and I think on this issue, it's been very hidden. So I think there's so much more, the attention on it is both going to start changing behavior without that change in legislation, and increases the potential to change that, to get an amendment in the future, right? Where people are really understanding what's happening. I think, that gives me hope. And I do think that scrutiny by companies in their boardrooms of where their political money goes, which many executives don't really know, for sure. Some do, but a lot really don't know exactly where their money goes, is going to be very useful.
Thanks, Mark Pape, for that question on Citizens United. The next question, Daniella and Grant, is from Elizabeth Cousins on the youth and your views on how do you see the polarization dynamics from a youth standpoint, given everything going on around democracy?
It's a good, Grant, you're younger than I, you want to start?
I mean, it's a really good question. And the reason why I think we'll probably go silent is because it's so difficult. Elizabeth, I'm assuming you're probably citing some of the same data that we've seen, which is kind of terrifying, that like the younger you go in terms of age brackets, the more likely you are to find support for authoritarian alternatives.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, right. Exactly. I don't know what the solution is to that. I mean, I think, the lines to connect between structural reforms that make it so much easier to see oneself represented in government and government being responsive to you, and outcomes like you see in that data, like drawing those links is really hard, but I think it's probably right. And I don't really have much more besides that.
Yeah, I think it's really tricky. I do think what that does speak to is both, I mean, I obviously agree the necessity of structural reforms that make the system more fair and effective. And then also a real focus on effectiveness of the system at delivering. Elizabeth and I had the pleasure of working together for for many years within government. And, I think the systems of political, if you look at faith and democracy and kind of trust in government, let's say, and faith and democracy, but trust in government of Western OECD countries, basically, right? Western democracies, they have all been in decline. And I think part of that, there's not been a real focus on renewing just the structures and effectiveness, and people have become used to kind of digital technologies and really rapid response, et cetera. So I think proving that government can address current challenges, which right now obviously is so proximate with COVID and with many other issues, has to be a priority for all who care about democracy as well.
Yeah. I'll add actually one example to that kind of links to some of the work that we're doing, which I hadn't really made this connection until, Elizabeth, you asked this question, but like gun control is a really good example where, the percentage of Americans who support really basic changes to like the gun control regime is extraordinary. In fact, we're made to believe that we're really polarized on this issue, when in fact, like that just like simply not the case when you look at the data, right? In terms of support for specific proposals. In Congress, somehow the rules are set up in such a way that very small minorities of members in both chambers are able to derail what otherwise would be a relatively consensus-oriented debate. And so some of the stuff that we're working on, and I know that Leadership Now has been involved in various ways, is supporting efforts like the Committee on the Modernization of Congress, which for those who aren't familiar is a body that was stood up a couple of years ago and has been reauthorized for this Congress, to think about the ways in which Congress can be modernized such that its rules and its processes and procedures are more effective, they're more responsive to the public, because a lot of this stuff is just simply not a given. I'll give you one quick example, like the power that the Senate Majority Leader has, certainly not in the Constitution, and a lot of it's not even written down. We've just decided that power sits with the Majority Leader, and that doesn't actually have to be the case. And so I think there's probably a lot of opportunities, including within Congress itself, to solve a lot of the challenges that would make government a lot more responsive and effective.
Next question is around political contributions from Dina. And are political contributions and lobbying expenses tax deductible for corporations?
I don't believe any of them are, actually. Yeah, no, I don't think they can be treated as a business expense, or they can't. But the reality is for large companies, they're small. That's the so that's the irony. But yeah, so I don't know that that's a big driver of the overall equation, but certainly they're major contributors. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I see the other question around social media and so in terms of do pro-democracy players, the question, have a strategy for social media and reducing its harmful effects? I think there are definitely, a wide variety of actors, not only on the democracy side, but in the kind of freedom of the press side, as well as, advocates around, responsible privacy for social media and disinformation. Like, there's definitely a set of actors who are working on those issues in various ways. PEN America is one that does some really interesting work on disinformation. There's, different angles. They work more with journalists, et cetera. So all of that said, I think the solutions are so big that are needed to actually like change the media ecosystem, that I don't know that there's really an effort that's sufficiently robust. I do think we've obviously seen some very significant actions by the social media companies in the last month with, deplatforming Trump and pulling him off Twitter and Facebook and other things, and kind of, making Parler not viable. Those are pretty big deals. And I think the only solutions on these have to have the social media companies. I mean, they can be pushed, and they have been pushed, but they're going to have to take actions that somewhat could be legislated, but also need to be kind of designed within their softwares and technologies and built into the way that their business model and ecosystem works to be successful.
If I could jump in with a quick follow-up there to flesh that out a little bit. And hello, Amit, nice to meet you by video. On the social media question, a thought-provoking question perhaps is, could the issues we've seen, whether Trump longer term or Trump in the recent term, would they have been possible without social media? So that if we look at all the funds flows and so forth, and social media, I don't think appeared to be a large part of it, at least, going back over the last few years relative to all the other spending, and yet they have a disproportionate impact relative to their spending. So just wondering if in the course of all the efforts to rein in some of these issues and enhance democracy, if it shouldn't even start with social media as kind of a big contributor to the problems we've seen in just the last few years.
I'll offer just like a quick reaction, and I just want to caveat this, that I'm like no expert on this topic whatsoever. However, before working with Protect Democracy, I spent a number of years working abroad, mostly in contexts of violent conflict. And I think one of like my big observations was that, at least in the context of other countries, where conflict looks, much more grievous than it is right here, now at least, social media companies put unbelievable fuel on already existing fires, and they made them much worse, right? I'm thinking of places like Myanmar or Sri Lanka or Kenya, where the role of social media has been like incredibly unproductive and really dangerous, but they weren't the root causes of those problems. They've just made them a lot worse. And I would suspect something is similar here. We've also had authoritarian impulses in this country for a very long time, like far predating, right, the rise of big tech. And so I think it's fair to say they're making the problem worse in really concerning ways, and they're politically dangerous. And at the same time, that even if you were to kind of fix the social media problem, the underlying problems aren't going anywhere.
There was just to build on that, there was an article, I think it was in the Atlantic last year, and there was some follow-up discussion around how when fascism was rising and the authoritarian orientations in Europe in the 30s and 40s, that was also the advent of radio, television, the sort of social media for their time. And the fact that governments didn't quite have rules in place for how to leverage those, how to have them be part of it, it led potential strongmen, potential authoritarian leaders to leverage it. So part of it might just be we're at that sort of a point in which getting structure around it might be key. Let's jump to Elizabeth. Question around COVID.
Elizabeth, I think that was maybe a follow-up to the other point.
Yeah, it was just a comment into the chat. So I didn't mean to disrupt the flow.
Oh, Elizabeth, I did want to make a quick comment because I was struck by your question. I've been thinking about that with 3 teenager age kids. that's been something on our mind as well. Even in joking, when you hear about among friends and so forth, this sort of this question on, is democracy the right way, right? And people questioning, not just in the U.S. but globally. Harari, the author of *Sapien* and so forth, he's been making this whole point around meaning, and that with so much change happening, technology, globalization, all of these forces economically, inequality, race, that it's hard sometimes when you're young to like know what is what. Like, where do you put your North Star in? You go back a few centuries or millennia, God, or my government or my family or my tribe. There were certain ways that you could organize meaning, and I think it's a great question that you're asking, about how might youth evolve. I mean, it's actually a fascinating question. It's got me thinking about it, because I think here in the U.S. it's also, there's so many disconnects that are out there. So let's see how this. I mean, in some ways, I think to Grant's point, there's so much work still to do. It's not one and done, regardless of your political affiliation. The fact that we had an inauguration and a peaceful transfer of power is a great celebration of democracy. But it's really not one and done, because the trust factors, the money in politics, and some of these other things are really still there. And it's that perception part of the youth. I'm already thinking of like a study, Daniella, that could actually do a pulse check, maybe with Edelman or elsewhere, around how does that youth segment look at these things differently from others. So
yeah, there's some great work actually. There's a group called More in Common. That we work with and we've supported, who does a whole looks at I can put that in the chat as well, looks at the kind of divides the US population in terms of the political spectrum, but not just Democrat, Republican, like much more nuanced. And they talk about the kind of exhausted majority, which is like many segments of the population beyond the extremes. But they also look at young people and kind of Gen Z and where they are. And they, I think, as you kind of pointed out, Elizabeth and Grant, in terms of, I mean, very disconcerting in terms of what they're feeling. And I think to your point, Amit, like this kind of feeling of being disconnected from the society and the system, and not feeling that kind of like affiliation and faith in the institutions, or, any particular institution. Yeah, I think is worrying.
Yeah,
and how do we, but how do we rebuild that? And what does that look like?
Any other questions? Any other comments? Now, Lance, did we organize, like with the inauguration a couple of days ago, like a fireworks to inaugurate this Chevy Chase talk with Daniella and Grant? Or is that?
We didn't, but we're going to get everybody the Diet Coke button that's on the call that Trump had removed from the, or Biden had removed from the desk yesterday. So
okay, I just put something on the chat that could be a topic of discussion here.
Thanks, Joan. Following up on what you're talking about, is democracy the best way to go? Might be helpful to clarify what it means to democracy.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was thinking, the will of the majority can sometimes come across as authoritarian itself. So we have certain values that we superimpose on the will of the majority when we talk about democracy. We expect there to be protection for minorities and minority viewpoints.
I'll just offer, in solidarity with the complexity of that question, even at my organization, which is literally has democracy in the name, we're going through like a really big strategic planning process for what the next few years will look like for us. And this is the hairiest point. Like, even consensus, we have, 75, 80 employees, even consensus among a group of people who have dedicated themselves to protecting this thing, what this thing really means is unbelievably difficult to give like thorough and consensus voice to, which is to say, I don't really have a good answer other than that, but.
Yeah. But I do think we've thought about like the need for a new political lexicon in general, right? Because so many of the terms, like what does even left and right really mean anymore from a policy perspective? What does capitalism versus socialism mean? What does democracy mean? Like, the need to kind of create almost clarify and update definitions that we use to describe politics. And we always try to like stay away from typical language, almost like use language that's not, you know, even take language from like business or other fields to describe things as a way to kind of neutralize the kind of so many of the words that are so laden with meaning or different meanings from different groups. Yeah, that's actually the group I mentioned before, More in Common, does a lot of that work to understand how different segments hear different words in politics. And I do think that's definitely part of the challenge here, both defining democracy and defining.
Joan, on your question, one of the tasks at one point Daniella had invited me to participate in was this discussion on civic engagement in high school. If you remember, I think that was with the Renew Democracy Initiative, Daniella. And the question was civics, Joe. You know, civics was something that you did in middle school or elementary or at some point. That notion of civics, that notion of studying civics, like what does it mean to be a citizen when you're a young person? How do you define it? And, you know, that sort of idea of kind of an updated definition of it that takes advantage and recognition of technology and all of the different fragments and impacts of social media and so forth. It's a great question. It's a great question.
Sandra Day O'Connor has done a lot about that. I'm not sure what her definition of civics is, and I don't know quite what her foundation is doing on it now that I gather she's not well, but I don't know if you've looked at that, at her efforts on behalf of civics.
I'll check that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
this is great. Well, I want to, on behalf of the Chevy Chase Village, thank you both, Daniella and Grant, very much. You guys are on the front lines of really helping us as a country, as a society, as a community here in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, really help us to raise our awareness, which is what these kinds of conversations do. But more importantly, you guys are really having huge impact. And so we're really just want to say thank you. Very energizing discussion. And like any good conversation, it leaves you with some things to think about. So thanks so much. And congratulations to all of us on the democratic efforts of this week.
Indeed.
Seriously. Everyone on this phone. No, thank you, Amit and Lance, Grant, and everyone else who joined.
Have a great weekend, guys.
Take care.
Thank you, folks. That was wonderful.